Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Olivia. I'm the Public Programs Manager at APC, and I want to thank you all again for joining us for our webinar tonight, Standing Up for Women's History. Before we get started with the webinar, I just want you to ask you all to join us for our land acknowledgement. So the land on which we gather at Paulsdale is part of the traditional territory of the Lenni Lenape, called Lenape Hoping. The Lenape people lived in harmony with one another upon this territory for thousands of years. During the colonial era and early federal period, many were removed west and north, but some also remain among the continuing historical tribal communities of the region: the Nanticoke Lenni Lenape Tribal Nation, the Ramapo Lenape Nation, and the Powhatan Lenape Nation. We acknowledge the Lenni Lenape as the original people of this land and their continuing relationship with their territory. In our acknowledgement of the continued presence of the Lenape people in their homeland, we affirm the aspiration of the great Lenape chief Temamend, that there be harmony between the indigenous people of this land and the descendants of the immigrants to this land, as long as the rivers and creeks flow and the sun, moon, and stars shine. Before I introduce our speakers today, I just want to remind everyone that we invite you to share your questions for the Q&A portion of our program. You'll be able to type those in the Q&A function. We are dedicated to making all our spaces, virtual and otherwise, safe and inclusive for everyone. Harassment of any kind will not be tolerated in verbal or written comments during our programs. If anyone chooses to engage in racist, sexist, trans, or homophobic speech, they will be removed from the program without further warning. Thank you for being a part of our community. And now I'd like to take a moment to introduce our panelists before turning it over to them. Kristen Kelly has an MA in Cultural Historical Religion from the Graduate Theological Union, Berkeley, and teaches all high school levels. She created a popular Gender and Sexuality in the Bible course and co-taught the interdisciplinary Women's Studies courses, as well as AP Government and Politics courses with Serene. Kristen loves collaborating with scholars and teachers and has presented at the National Women's Studies Association Conference, the National Council for Social Studies, and the Berkshire Conference for Women Historians. Kristen loves teaching religion and history from an intersectional lens, focusing especially on gender and sexuality issues. Kelly Marino is an associate teaching professor at Sacred Heart University. She researches the intersections between the 19th Amendment and education. Her book, Votes for College Women, was published by NYU Press in 2024. Wendy Rouse is professor of history and program coordinator for the Social Science Teacher Preparation Program at San Jose State University. Her scholarly research focuses on the history of women, gender, and sexuality during the Progressive Era. Rouse's most recent book, Public Faces, Secret Lives: The Queer History of the Women's Suffrage Movement, explores the way that suffragists challenged the gender norms of their era. Serene Williams has taught social science courses at the high school and collegiate level for over 20 years at both public and private schools. She has 2 degrees in political science and teaches numerous AP courses. Serene has also written curriculum for many women's history courses. Together with Kristen Kelly, she created a national campaign calling for the creation of an AP US Women's History course, also known as WayPush. Their petition has gained over 2,600 signatures and has support from leading scholars in the field. Serene runs the website Women's History in High School and oversees an internship program of students from multiple states who are working to increase representation of women at the secondary level. Thank you all for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much, Livia, for that introduction. So thank you all for joining us tonight. I'm going to give just a very brief talk about the campaign for AP Women's History that we have going, and then Kristen's going to share a little bit more details about that. And thank you to Kelly Marino and Wendy Rouse for joining us as well. Should be a very interesting discussion tonight. This panel came about after the Big Berks conference was canceled, one of the most important conferences for women's historians. And it's been an honor to work with Kelly and Wendy and kind of bridge what is often a divide between academic scholarship and high school teachers. So for the past 3 years, Kristen Kelly and I have had a campaign to create a AP Women's History course, the first nationwide course on women's history. And I'm going to put a website on the chat. Much of what I'm going to talk about, you can find a lot more detail on there. And I don't know if it'll let me put it in the chat. The website, you can just go to womenshistoryinhighschool.com or teachwaypush.org, and I will screen share and show you a few things. So Kristen, for the last several weeks, Kristen and I have been revamping our website, and I just want to show you a few resources that we have on there, and then happy to answer any questions that you have about the campaign. So I'm going to go up here to the WayPush campaign. So Kristen and I have been meeting with Trevor Packer, who's the director of curriculum for the College Board. Our initial plan was to write more women into existing AP courses, but after researching at the Schlesinger Library at Harvard a few summers ago, Kristen and I decided that women's history is really worthy of its own year-long AP course. So in order to pilot the course, we had to get support from 100 universities, which we've been successful in doing, and Kristen will speak more about how we did that. And we need to gather 250 letters of support from high schools, and we need about 190 more. And that's going to be a big push of what we're going to work on in the next school year. On our website, and Kristen will speak briefly about this, but if you'd like more detail, you can go to our university support for WayPush, and you can see the letters that universities have issued to us. And universities are saying if students take this course in high school, they are willing to grant college credit to them. So we have over 100 letters of support from universities. We have a campaign here for high schools. The WayPush campaign also has significant support from some really important nationwide groups. We got recent support from the National Women's Political Caucus, the National Women's History Alliance. I know there are several of you on the call tonight. Thank you so much for joining us. The National Women's History Museum, and we've been meeting with their directors, the scholars that are part of their board of directors. So Kristen will speak a little bit more about what that process has been like. So you can see our organizations, you can see public support. I also just want to quickly show you a project that we've had throughout the year, which is partnering with students. So Kristen and I have been overseeing a project where high school students are reaching out to important scholars or people who've made women's history. We're interviewing them, we're transcribing the interviews, and we're putting them on here. So you can see at the top, we just did recently Bettina Apthekar. We have some scientists. We have Father Ann, who is campaigning for women's ordination. We've interviewed Mary Lee Sargent. We've also interviewed Wendy Rouse several times, so her interviews are on there too. And so this has been an amazing project that we've done alongside our students. So definitely recommend that you go to our website and check out the oral interviews. So I will stop there, and Kristen, you can go ahead and share the rest.
Thank you for having us this evening and for joining our campaign, even if it's just to listen. Let me fangirl real quick. Gloria Steinem just recently endorsed us, which for me is like a bucket list of like fangirl, and such an honor. Also, Dolores Herta has verbally been very on board, particularly at the Ms. Magazine luncheon earlier this month, or last month, pardon me. My kind of, part of this presentation is going to be what it's been like as far as surveillance in this journey. So I don't know, and Serene, please, let's do this conversation. So I'll interject and check my periodization as you always do. But in October, around that time, we met with the National Women's History Alliance and some scholars in a private meeting because Serene and I, mostly Serene, wrote the entire CED, the course exam description. Every AP course has a course exam description where it's the units and the topics all, kind of outlined for the teachers, the instructors. So these scholars went through all 109 pages of it and gave us incredible advice. And some of the best advice that we got was from Hillary Clinton's personal historian, who's overseeing Hillary Clinton's oral history project, Dr. Alita Black. everybody was being like very nice and like very cordial and like, oh, this is great, this is great. And then she was like, no nonsense. She was like, get a pen, get a paper. And this was in October. This is before the election. She said, any word, they're going to do an AI search, and any word with 3 syllables is going to trigger surveillance. Essentially, the different groups of Mothers for Liberty and the people going up to school boards. She's like, every time you say the word patriarchy, it needs to go. The word patriarchy needs to go. The word settler colonialism needs to go. Intersectionality needs to go. Indigenous needs to go. Serene, fact check me on all this. Like, there's so many more that I'm probably, but like, literally how many, I want to 60-70% of our curriculum. I mean, how do you teach a class on women and not use the word patriarchy, right? So then we have to say rule by men. But that's interesting because a lot of times women use patriarchy, right? So how do we do this work under surveillance when literally our actual etymology is under distress, right? And is being questioned by AI bots, right? So right from the start, Serene went through and kind of revamped the entire curriculum because the goal of this is bipartisan acceptance and unity. The goal of this is for Florida to be okay and excited to teach about women, right? Like in a lot of these states, particularly Tennessee, they were the state that helped ratified, our right to vote. So like we want and embrace and desire their acceptance of our course, and we do not want to get involved in a political argument. Because I like to say this all the time, women aren't woke. Women are just women. There's Republican women. There's women aren't a monolithic block. They never have been. They never will be. So it's very bipartisan representative, this course, by design, because it's inviting and it's real history. It's good history. And it's been interesting because we're waiting to get a lot of pushback. And the only places we've really seen it personally is we've been book banned at, as we're teaching for graphic novels. So we no longer give summer reading because we don't know where that'll land or how that'll land. And we want to, again, be inviting to all voices at the table. But it has been interesting doing this work because we are very careful all the time of everything that we say, every handout we give, everything that's public facing, even this being videoed, we have to be very careful because it's public facing for any type of backlash. And this is, we teach and work in the Bay Area. So even in the Bay Area, that's a very real thing. And we want to honor that for educators all over this country as we begin this scholarship. Also, with the work too, when we present at conferences, I actually have a Girl Scout troop, a middle school girls that presented at the California Council of Social Studies that were straight up told that women weren't in history, that why are you trying to change history? Women cooked and cleaned while the men made the history. And they presented on that because it happened to them during the expo hall in March. And they presented on it in their presentation. And it was an interesting learning curve as a teacher watching students, have to navigate that and process that and then dialogue with it. So teaching under surveillance and then designing a course like this under surveillance has been a journey, and every word out of my mouth is careful, as you can even hear me say right now. And it's a lot of labor to do that, to not just be able to be like, no, it's the patriarchy and, that's not intersectional. Oh, and you're being transphobic and, all of that. It's like a constant work in not just emotional regulation, but like scholarship regulation. Like, is that even a thing now? But it feels like that. Like we can't just say the scholarship anymore without a sense of fear. We used to just be able to like throw down, legal terms and throw down the scholarship. But now that seems like with this world of alternative facts, that's no longer a safeguard. When you're like, but that's not good history, that's not true, that doesn't protect you or at all carry the weight that it used to. It's interesting though, at the same time, this work has been, and I mean this personally, like an emotional salvation for me in the current times. The community that we have built of women and scholars has been a source of like insane strength and, to be honest, happiness when sometimes I feel really, really, really overwhelmed. And I don't know what my next move is. Like I really depend upon all these incredibly strong women I have met over the years working on these projects through these webinars. And it's almost like a source of like, we can keep going. Like we do have each other. It's a source of strength and it's an incredible community. So teaching under surveillance is simultaneously very, very, it's terrifying. It's terrifying. Having to get rid of the word patriarchy in 2025, like, I don't even know how to tell my professors and the shame that I feel having to do that and having to not use the word intersectionality. I feel like a hypocrite all the time. But at the same time, we need to survive the current situation and prolong the work. Thank you.
Is it okay for me to? Okay. So thank you guys so much for giving me the opportunity to join you on this webinar panel today. I really appreciate it. And it's wonderful to get to see everybody on the panel, especially again. And also I saw some people that I recognize the names in the audience too, which was really exciting. I'm going to share my screen. I have a slideshow. It's pretty brief, but I'm going to pull it up. And I'm just going to talk for a couple minutes about some of the work that I've been doing and kind of like a little bit about how I got to this work and some sort of reflections on why it's important to be teaching women's history despite everything that's going on currently. And so, just a little bit about my background. I have studied a lot related to the connections between education and the history of the 19th Amendment. And the reason that I came to that topic is I started my career actually in social studies education. My undergraduate degree is a BSED in history for secondary ed, and I have a Connecticut State Teacher certification. So I actually began my career thinking that I was going to be either a middle school or high school social studies teacher. And then I thought, well, I'll just continue on and get my master's degree and then see how things play out from there. And when I got to grad school, I felt very much like a fish out of water. And I kept asking myself the question, what can you bring to the table that's kind of different? And I felt like the one thing that I had that was different than a lot of other people was that I had this pedagogy background, this education background. And I then asked myself, how could I use those skills and the ideology and also the pedagogy to kind of shape the work that I'm doing, the research that I'm doing, to look at the sources in a different way? And when I started to study the suffrage movement, I started to notice that a lot of the suffragists were teachers or former school administrators, and they tended to come from that background. And again, if you weren't someone that was passionate about that, I'm not sure it would be something that you clued into or sort of focused on. But because of my background, I was like, okay, I can relate to these figures because of a shared sort of interest and sort of training. And I noticed over time that a lot of students were suffragists, and campuses, both whether it be K-12 or whether it be, the higher ed, became spaces at different moments for activism. Suffragists held different events at schools. They held them on college campuses. And I started to think about, given my own background as a teacher, how might that, if I was an activist, how might that inform my activism? And how might that have informed these women's activism during this particular time period, shaped the tactics they were using to reach the public, their campaign methodology? And that led me to a lot of interesting conclusions in the work that I've done, first on the Connecticut Women's Suffrage Association, and then more broadly looking at college student activism, and now my new book looking at sort of the effects of the 19th Amendment on education in general, which has been really, really interesting to kind of explore. And so I'm going to talk for a couple minutes about the story of one woman, Mary McLeod Bethune, who has a very interesting history. And I want to use her story to kind of get at why I think women's history is so important and why telling these stories is so valuable. So she was born in 1875 on a cotton farm in Maysville, South Carolina, to a very large family, I learned. Her parents were formerly enslaved, and she was very passionate about education from a young age. So for a woman during the time period, even, she was able to do some remarkable things, get actual scholarships during this time period to attend Scotia Seminary in North Carolina, Moody Bible Institution. I don't know why I'm like very tongue-tied this afternoon or this evening, in Illinois. And then she went on to try to develop her own school, again, very pioneering from the time period, in Florida. And ultimately, this particular school was formed in 1904. And at first, it was a sort of a normal school for usually those are for teacher training. They're very practical in nature for young Black girls in Florida. But eventually, over time, it merged with a local college for African American men in 1923. And it became Bethune-Cookman College, which now is a university. And so during this time period, she did become involved in suffrage activism. So in 1912, I found out that she joined the Equal Suffrage League. I learned that was an affiliate of the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, which was a pretty big organization during the time period that attracted a lot of support from sort of well-educated, middle-class African Americans hoping to sort of uplift and improve the plight of African Americans in the future during this particular time period. After 1920, I found that she was campaigning to make sure that Black voting rights were protected. She went door to door trying to raise money to pay the poll tax that aimed to stop African Americans from voting. She taught reading at night to members of the local community, the African American community, so that they could actually pass literacy tests. And she was harassed for doing this by the KKK during the time period, as just one example. And interestingly enough, during this early time period in the 20th century, before a lot of really notable civil rights activism was going on later in the century, she practiced what Martin Luther King would call nonviolent civil disobedience. So after the KKK sort of threatened to attack and burn down her school, she had sort of a vigil in front of the school to kind of protect it with a number of her students and colleagues. She led sort of a group of African Americans to the polls in Florida to make sure that they could actually vote, strengthen sort of numbers showing up. And over time, she also did a lot of community outreach. She opened the school's library, providing free reading material for the community. She worked for the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs as a president, the Federation of Colored Women's Clubs in Florida as a president, helped to found the National Council of Negro Women, and promoted, like a lot of African American middle and upper class women involved in the reform movements in the 20th century, healthcare for African Americans, school integration, and then had a remarkable political career beyond just an activist career and work as an educator, serving in the Hoover administration, the Coolidge administration, and the FDR administration in different political capacities, and even becoming a friend of like Eleanor Roosevelt, by World War II assistant director of the Women's Army Corps. So this is very impressive for a Black woman to have such a political role and be so successful in so many capacities and very public in her activism during this time period where there's a lot of racial tension and discrimination, especially in the South. And so why do I tell this story? I think it's to make sort of 2 points about why we should teach women's history. The first point is just very basic. You know, ultimately, the country was founded on these ideas about democracy and equality, but the reality, as we all know, is that there's still so much inequality. And even though the Victorian ideas of the male breadwinner and the domestic housewife go all the way back to the 1800s, and you would think by 2025 that those things would have faded away, the reality is they have not. And if anything, I think they've become sort of popular again, especially among the younger generation to a certain extent, kind of glorifying that role of the domestic housewife. Again, to a certain extent, culturally, it's become something that's been very popular in social media and things like that. And the reality is there's still so much discrimination and inequality that women face within society. And it's in a variety of realms. And some of the examples that I have, I just have 2 slides left, kind of illustrate this inequality in the professions and the trades. And so, you know, we still, of course, have pay inequality. I have a graph on the next slide, like in a chart. There's inequality in women's opportunities for advancement. So when students are going to contemporary schools, I think it's really important to teach women's history because I think young women need to have these stories, the stories of these role models who have done exceptional things, who have gone into politics, and even though it was difficult, right, it succeeded, gone in and become these very talented educational leaders, creating schools, creating institutions, even creating businesses, gone and, you know, become these public figures, political figures that are very successful, both, you know, economically and even in terms of their political power and sort of their reputation nationally. I think it's important for young women to see this, because then they can also, easily kind of, or more easily think of themselves in those roles. When I was younger, I took a sociology class and we studied Max Weber, and we read about the notion of habitus and what it's this idea of like what you think the possibilities could be for your life. And as you're raised, your ideas of what you might do or what you could do are very much shaped by social, cultural forces, and of course, the messaging you're getting from various institutions. And so if students grow up and they're not learning about women's history, and men are, the head of all the companies, the leaders of all the political parties, the people in charge of all the schools, they're not getting the messaging that this is actually a possibility of something that I could do too. So I think it's really important to tell the story of these remarkable women, like the one that I just mentioned, because I think that it kind of expands young people's mindset in terms of what is possible for me when I grow up, and kind of gets them thinking about, opportunities that they could then, potentially pursue. And so the last slide that I have just has some charts and graphs. And again, I just pulled some stuff that relates to women in the workplace. And so there's a chart on national inequality in terms of pay. So this is 2025, and it says in the US, women working full-time year-round earn about 17% less than men for the same work. The other chart has to do with women in leadership positions. So it's women that are heads of S&P 500 companies. This is a little bit older. This chart is from 2018. But I mean, I know like on my end, the Zoom thing is blocking part of the chart, but it says like 5.2% of women are actually CEOs of companies, and only about 11% of the top earners in these S&P 500 companies are actually women. So it just, I think, illustrates how much inequality exists and why these stories are so important. And so thank you guys so much for listening, and I'll turn it over to Dr. Rouse.
Thank you. That was great. Thank you so much. Okay, let me get my thing up here. All right, so I wanted to talk about, can you see it now? Yeah, we're good. Okay. I wanted to talk a little bit about queer women's history and what's happened in the past and what's happening now. I've been working on researching queer women's history and specifically the queer history of the women's suffrage movement for about 10 years now. And what I uncovered through the course of my research was not only how difficult it was to do this kind of research, but also to even advocate for the teaching or reading of this research. It was women's history, also because it was queer history. And this long history of erasure that accompanies this type of history. So teaching women's history, and especially queer women's history, I think is in itself an act of resistance. And I think it's essential to be teaching about this because we have all sorts of external and internal oppressions that contribute to this historical erasure, whether it's individuals erasing their own history because of fear, or homophobic folks erasing this history, transphobic folks erasing this history. It's very difficult to even find evidence of it as you're going through. But the suffrage movement, and I make this point whenever I give a presentation, is very diverse, right? It included women, range of sexual and gender identities, many of whom were in same-sex romantic relationships or sexual relationships. They were often prominent members of the suffrage movement. So in that sense, the movement itself was quite diverse, quite inclusive, but they weren't always public about their relationships. And that's because they were concerned with evading external criticism. They were concerned about propping up a respectable public image. So they hid parts of this history from the public, parts of their lives from the public. And you can see in some cases, other folks whose entire role in the movement was completely erased, mostly because they were a little bit too radical for some mainstream suffragists, a little bit too outspoken. And so you see these various processes of erasure. And I think it's important to teach this when you're teaching the history of the suffrage movement. And then I think it's also important to trace this into the future. So to not just focus on this era, but to move forward and to think about the fact that the erasure of this history becomes even more intense in the era after the passage of the 19th Amendment. I usually stop my presentations there and I cover the history and then I don't move forward. But I think it's important to talk about what happens in the late 1940s, beginning in World War II, but continuing at full force after World War II into the 1950s and into the 1960s. And if you teach a US history survey course, you probably taught about the Lavender Scare, right? And thinking about its impact, the Red Scare, the Lavender Scare, on specifically on LGBTQ folks. The government is seeking to identify and purge homosexuals from government employment, right? And this is not just at the federal level. It impacts state, it impacts local governments, it impacts private companies that adopt similar policies. And at the same time, we see the intensity of the criminalization of homosexuality and gender deviance. We see the medical fields, the psychological fields pathologizing queer identities. And so for many queer people, just being out becomes very dangerous because you might lose your job, you might be institutionalized, right? There's all sorts of impacts to being out in the open. And so when we talk about the closet, this is often where we see it happening, intensely so. So if you think about it, then some of these suffragists now, they're older, they're aging, and they're wanting to hide some of their own history and lives because it's just not safe. So there's, in some senses, having to publicly conform, to conceal, as they're watching people lose their jobs, people being arrested and institutionalized. So what we see is more closeting, more erasure of queer history and women's history during this time. And after the purges of the Lavender Scare end in the 1960s, we still have the stigma that's attached to it. We still have those laws in some cases that still exist. Even after the Stonewall riots, and everybody likes to point to that, and gay liberation movement, right? It's still not safe for a lot of people to be out, as society still has not fully accepted the idea that queer people are full human beings with equal rights. So what we see is that queer women and their families are still often destroying that history, concealing their private lives. And so we see biographers using coded language maybe to talk about people that were friends, right? And this is the joke that always goes around on social media, is historians think they were just close friends or their companions. And it kind of negates the significance of queer relationships. We see the destruction of photographs, letters, etc. And so the public history of the suffrage movement, but really of all queer folks' history, is erased in this process. So recovering this history is really, really hard. And I talk a lot about this when I give talks on the research, because you're not only fighting for what scraps of evidence remain, but you're also fighting against the stigma that's attached to researching this history or studying this history. And when I started researching this history in the late 2010s, mid 2010s, I should say, there was still a lot of hostility toward this topic. And it wasn't something that people were exactly enthusiastic about. It was very difficult to secure any kind of research support or funding, not just because it was women's history, but because it was queer history, and it further marginalized it. And it really wasn't until the centennial that people started to say, okay, we do want to tell this part of the story too, for the purposes of inclusivity. And I was shocked by that because it was not a new thing. Queer history wasn't new. I was standing on the shoulders of some giants in the 1980s and 1990s, some very significant queer scholars who had broke open the field of lesbian history. And so it was surprising to me to still get that pushback in the 2010s. And then the process of doing this research was very complex. You know, I'm tracking down what evidence remains in the archives and contacting descendants and family members to see whatever is left. I'm deciphering scribbled love notes in the back of journals and trying to figure out what these poems say. And I'm really looking at things that were meant to be purged that just happened to be saved. I'm looking at sentimental objects and artifacts. I'm looking at death records and wills, and I'm traveling to look at cemeteries and burial sites and monuments, hoping for any clues. And I'm piecing together this history, and it's worth it because I'm telling stories that haven't been told before, and we're recovering this lost history. But we still don't have a complete picture of it because of this whole history of erasure. And I just want to say that resisting erasure is only possible when queer love letters were saved by individuals and family members who secreted them away, hoping that in the future there would be a much more tolerant era. Resisting erasure is only possible when archivists preserved this forbidden material that was taboo to even have, topics such as homosexuality, and they obscured or coded the search terms, tucking them away in the archives somewhere so people wouldn't notice. And resisting erasure is only possible when historians conduct this careful research, decide it's important enough to research, and dig up the evidence that remains to try to reconstruct the stories. And resisting erasure is only possible when teachers are brave enough to actually teach about it in the classroom. And so here we are again, right? And this is where I have to kind of calm and center myself, because we're in this moment yet again. Presently, the Trump administration is aggressively attempting to erase not just LGBTQ history, but specifically trans and genderqueer people from past and present. On its first day in office, January 2025, he issues a whole flurry of executive orders. Several of them were aimed specifically at trans people. One order was to eliminate gender ideology extremism. He eliminated DEI programs, et cetera. And then in February, we start to see this erasure taking place across all federal government websites. The one that got the most media attention was the National Park Service purging references to trans and queer people from the Stonewall National Monument site. They literally took out the T and the Q and the plus and just left LGB. And this ignited popular uproar, right? This culminated in some protests and a lot of media coverage about it. But federal governments also altered an article. They altered hundreds of articles on their website. One of them that was caught up in it early on was mine on the queer history of the suffrage movement. I had written this for the National Park Service in 2020. And the day after they did the Stonewall thing, they had changed my article and they had deleted all references to trans and genderqueer people from the article. And I reached out to them and asked them to please restore the original because it was distorting the intent of my article. And instead, they took it down because they didn't want to violate any federal government orders. And so what we see then is hundreds, after that point, hundreds and hundreds of articles removed, deleted, altered on just the National Park Service site alone. And that still exists to this day. If you go there, it's been months now, and this information has not been restored. And this is just national parks that I'm talking about. This is across all federal government sites, and it's having a trickle-down effect on other sites as well, as people are following this trend of purging history. And I think I like to point out that this is not what the federal government is doing now is not limited to just the federal government, right? This is part of a much larger, what I call the rainbow panic that's been happening since the early 2020s. LGBTQ people have been feeling this since the early 2020s. We've witnessed the normalization of far-right extremism. They're resurrecting these lavender scare era tropes of queer people as predators. Extremists are fomenting this new moral panic. We see this at the local level with extremist groups co-opting school board meetings, pushing an agenda of bigotry against inclusive curriculum and specifically against trans and genderqueer people. We've seen hundreds of anti-trans laws since the early 2020s, criminalizing drag performances, censoring books, banning pride flags, sponsoring Don't Say Gay laws, restricting the teaching of queer history, LGBTQ plus history in schools, no conversation about that at all. We've seen right-wing commentators, podcasters, social media influencers, doxing educators, especially openly queer educators, inciting online harassment and real-life violence against history in general, but anybody who's advocating for that history or teaching that history. And this is part of what you all have already talked about being caught up in the middle of, right? You're experiencing this, you're living this. And this has essentially been going on since the early 2020s, but with the election of the Trump administration, with Donald Trump specifically in 2024, it elevated the rainbow panic to the national level with the full force and weight of the federal government behind it. And so a whole new wave of vitriol against the LGBTQ community has been unleashed upon us. And the targeting of history is intentional. They're depriving people of knowledge of their past because it's a way of denying them a place in the present. So as educators, we need our students to understand this, what is happening now. We need to be able to contextualize it. We need them to be able to see the process of erasure, but we also need to emphasize how it's salvaged, how it's preserved, and how it's passed on, even in the face of this type of oppression. And we can see that happening now. We can see historians and archivists and museum curators and librarians. We can see them attempting to educate the public about what's happening. We can see legal challenges of these policies in court. We can see efforts to subvert what the federal government is doing to preserve the past. Out History has been trying very hard to collect everything that's been purged and put it on their website, anything that they can. So queer historians, queer scholars, queer students are trying to protect this history because once again, we don't know what's going to happen if we don't. We don't want it to disappear. Some are overtly speaking out against the injustice, like everybody here on the panel today. Some of us are openly defying the administration, and others are working covertly behind the scenes, doing what they can with what they have, with where they're at, trying to preserve the history from being purged. And these are acts of defiance that we may not see, but we will remember when the time comes and we can preserve this history again. So we all have a role to play in this present moment, whether publicly or privately. We can each do our part to recover, preserve, and tell these stories. They don't want us to hear this history. They don't want us to learn this history, but we can keep passing it on. And as teachers, we have a duty in some sense to ensure that this knowledge is passed on to the next generation. Through the efforts of folks like us, we will ensure that these stories continue to be told for generations to come.
Awesome. Thank you all for sharing. We're going to open it up for Q&A now. So I just want to remind everyone that if you have a question you want to ask our panel, feel free to type it in the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom screen, and I will share with the panel. So I'll start with one to get us all started. I wanted to ask everyone on the panel if you had any insights or tips for teachers who want to teach queer history, who want to teach women's history, but feel like they're being surveilled or under pressure, for how they might still integrate these topics in their curriculums or fight back against this surveillance.
So I can start. I have several suggestions. So my first one is to educate yourself. You know, a lot of teachers, myself included, did not know a lot of this history. We were not taught it when we went to school. I was a gender studies minor in the 1990s, but I didn't learn any of this history. So the first thing I think teachers have to do is educate ourselves and make sure that we're really comfortable with the content. And then once you're comfortable with the content yourself and factual information, weaving it through and normalizing it as part of the story. You know, I'm an AP government teacher, for example, you know, cases like Obergefell or Lawrence v. Texas or Supreme Court cases that deal with LGBT rights. The more confident teachers are in knowing those facts, the more that they can just connect them to essential topics, you know, equal protection of the law, due process, 10th Amendment, states' rights. So those are my suggestions, is educate yourself and then just normalize this, that this is very important history for all of us to know.
I teach AP World History, and I find it easier in a global context. So I like to shape it with the Hijra in India, or third genders in indigenous societies, which trans people have always been here and always will be. And pretty much every society but ours reveals having a third gender as something sacred and something incredibly valued in their society. And then I like to use the stories of the Hijra, of the third gender, particularly in indigenous societies, and be like, why is it okay for them to be prophets and truth seers and turn it back on our society of, whereas here they're persecuted, right? And they're treated as subhuman. But I kind of like the global stories to kind of be the base of acceptance. And thousands of years before America was ever a thing, there were always trans folk, and trans folk were an amazing part of these communities. And then I just don't even acknowledge the current situation we're in, right? So global contextualization is always really a launching point I like to as a world historian as well. to be like, it's interesting. Why don't we look about how other cultures look at this and not just America?
I actually really liked some of the points that Serene started with, because I think it's really true. And I think recently, over the last like 10 or 15 years, there's been some really great histories that have come out. There's the African American Latinx history of the US by Paul Ortiz. There was a book on US history from an indigenous perspective. There's several books that look at queer history, and as you read these, I think they add layers to sort of your understanding of the past and add complexity and depth. And I know, again, coming from that background first as a social studies teacher, one of the things that we're always taught is that you want to gear the content to the audience in the room, and I think it's a growing and increasingly diverse audience. And I think that telling stories of different groups and including sort of the complexity of different stories really helps to kind of reach sort of like the modern learners, the diverse population that's in the classroom, and sort of resonate and allow them to kind of connect with the stories.
And I would just add that I know it's scary in this moment, especially when we're talking specifically about teaching queer history. And you obviously have to do what you have to do in your area to be safe for yourself. But I would say if you're even debating it, you should do it, because the more folks that do it, the safer we all are. I think you'd rather go down in history as standing on the right side of history than not. And you, as much as possible, be brave.
It's also just good history. We like to say that a lot. Like, you don't really see yourself as a student in the story unless some of the stories represent everybody, right? So like, it's good history to tell the truth of everybody involved, right? So when students ask about this, like, oh, like, isn't this sidebar history, or oh, this is just a small minority of the population, which means it's a part of the population, right? And those stories are fascinating. And like Serene said, like, normalizing, like, this is the human experience, and history is the human experience, the story of human experience, all humans.
Thank you. So I have a question in the chat. For those of us who are authors outside of academia, are there organizations that you recommend we contact to make our books and their subjects more widely known to academics and students?
I can start. So I would put a plug in for the National Women's History Alliance. So the National Women's History Alliance does amazing educational outreach and shares resources, not just from academics, but popular history, accessible history. And they write newsletters, email blasts, they send materials and paper copies to people's homes, and they're widely used by teachers. So the National Women's History Alliance, I think, does really amazing work. And then also the National Council of Social Studies. So the National Council of Social Studies does an incredible conference every year, and this year it's in DC. It's widely attended, it's widely respected, and that's a great place to connect with educators.
We've also done a lot of work this year with Girls Learn International, and Ms. Magazine is starting to launch Ms. in the Classroom, and to try and use Ms. Magazine as a secondary and sometimes even primary source for feminist initiatives. It's been really a good job with our students.
Okay, so I have another question in the chat. First, this person just wants to thank you all for your amazing and inspiring insights. They say, I'm wondering what you all think are the biggest challenges for resisting the censorship of feminist materials and women's history. The removal of Wendy's work from the National Park Service is so devastating, and I'm wondering what we can all do to fight back against censorship.
Well, right now, social media is a powerful way to fight back, I think, for sure. A lot of younger folks are on TikTok sharing queer history, which I think is a great way to get the information out there, because even if the books are banned and the scholarship is disappeared, I think that that's a good way to share the stories. Like, you're passing it on from person to person. So that's a good way.
you can't be complicit. There's a part of it where you do have to jump, right? And you do have to face fears with it, and you do it in, smartly, but you have to be able to sleep at night, and you have to be able to speak the truth. Like as an educator, I didn't get into education to not teach the truth. So a lot of times Rubicons are crossed, and I have to decide if I'm going to get fired today, like, and how that's going to go. And that's becoming more and more frequent. And at the same time, like, we all have to feed our families and pay our bills and all of the things. And education is like more of, it's not just employment, right? It's a vocation of, social outreach. So you have an ethical responsibility to those students in front of you to teach the truth. And if you can't do that, you have to be willing to face the consequences, right? You can't lie to your students, right? And the students see through that immediately, by the way, too. So you have to be willing to face the times where they are, unfortunately.
I think one thing that I've learned from being an academic over the last 10 years, because I graduated in 2016 with my PhD, is that, and I think this is just, and not even just in relation to censorship, but just in general, is that like you continue to put your work out there and you never give up, because there's always going to be, if you're diligent and consistent, a venue to get your material published. And the venues might change, the opportunities might change, but to not get discouraged if there's, sort of rejection from, a particular source, to continue to push forward and put it out there until you find a medium to make sure that you can get your words and your writing and your material sort of published and heard. And it seems like in academia and in the educational industry, when one door closes, another opens. And it seems like if you're persistent and diligent, there's always a way to kind of get to share your research and your material, which I think is, it's some of the stuff that's gone on, obviously, is sad. But I think that there's, again, as long as people are bold and continue to put out their ideas and their work, I think it does resonate, and there's venues for it.
All right, thank you all. I'm going to ask one more, and then I'll give participants a couple more minutes to, if they have any more questions, to put in the chat. But one thing I was thinking about when Wendy was talking earlier was the idea that this, this moral panic that we're facing, the backlash to some of these topics of women's history and queer history, this isn't the first time it's ever happened. Wendy was talking about the Lavender Scare, for example. So I'm wondering if this is kind of similar to the last question, but are there lessons from the past that we can think about for facing this current moment?
Yeah, I think people, I mean, there's a lot of different things you can take from the past, but one of the things I think that struck me is just how many people did try to protect and preserve this information, whether, like I said, hiding stuff in the archives or coding it in a different way so it didn't pop up. I'm sure there's people in the government now doing that. Ways to protect it, protect the information, to protect the history. People just boldly doing it anyway, like being out in the open anyway. A lot of why we have a queer liberation movement, why we had the gay liberation movement, was because people were like, we're going to stand up, we're going to fight back, and we're going to file lawsuits, we're going to do what we can. So I think it's a combination of strategies with what you're comfortable with and what you can do in your position, to be creative, to try to protect and preserve this history.
Yeah, and something I'd add that I've really learned from the past is about the importance of self-publishing. Kristen and I are not academics, and so we are not published in academic journals and things like that. And I've been really inspired. In the Bettina Apthekar interview that I mentioned earlier on our website, she talked about a woman named Betty Millard, who wrote a pamphlet about feminism in the 40s, and it was widely distributed. And I had never heard that story. And I researched the pamphlet and I got a copy of it. And it just really struck me that, you know, there are so many ways for people independently to do this work. Kristen and I started this very small oral interview project that turned into hundreds of hours this year. And, you know, we started out with the course description for the Weight Push course as 10 pages that turned into hundreds of pages based on just conversations that we've had. So I think the importance of figuring out ways to do this work outside of academia is really important and really empowering.
Awesome. Thank you all for that answer. So it looks like there's no more questions in the chat, so we'll wrap up for the night. I just want to say thank you again for all our panelists for joining us. This was a really amazing conversation. I have a lot of thoughts